You know that feeling when you're just sort of
Yeah.
off, tired, maybe achy, a bit foggy, and you really can't figure out why. It's pretty frustrating, right?
It really is. And often when people feel these persistent but kind of vague symptoms, there might be something underlying it all, a common thread.
Chronic inflammation.
Exactly. That's often the culprit hiding beneath the surface.
Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really digging into chronic inflammation. We've gathered information from, well, quite a few places.
Yes, places like St. Vincent's Medical Center, Healthline, and the more scientific papers on Stat Pearls and NCBI Bookshelf. Also insights from the UCLA Stress Lab.
Science Daily for the latest findings, Wolters Kluwer on communication, even Eastside Ideal Health Redmond. So our mission today really is to get a handle on the surprising ways this inflammation shows up, what's actually driving it, and importantly, what practical steps you might think about.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What exactly is inflammation? How does it work in the body?
Right, okay. So basically, think of inflammation as your body's, like its first responders, its defense team. When you get an infection or an injury or you're sick, inflammation kicks in. It's that initial protective reaction.
That's a good way to put it. And it's crucial, isn't it, to separate acute inflammation from chronic?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Acute is that quick short-term thing like you scrape your knee, it gets red and swollen, or a sudden infection. It hits hard, but then it, goes away relatively fast.
Whereas chronic inflammation, that's the tricky one. It's this low-level simmering process that can stick around for months or, gosh, even years.
And here's the ticker, really.
Yeah.
While acute inflammation is helpful, when it becomes chronic, that's when it can actually start to cause problems for your healthy parts.
It starts damaging healthy cells, tissues, maybe even organs over the long haul.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because while a doctor might spot some obvious signs, like, say, a swollen joint or a rash during an exam, the real impact of chronic inflammation often goes way beyond what you can easily see on the surface.
Exactly. Which brings us to what we're calling the surprising signs. We want to look at some of the less obvious ways chronic inflammation might be impacting people's lives. Things you wouldn't immediately connect, perhaps. What comes to mind for you there?
Well, before we jump into specific signs, maybe we should connect it to the bigger health picture, because chronic inflammation isn't just, feeling a bit off. It's deeply involved in some really serious diseases.
We're talking major league health problems here, aren't we?
Huh.
Things like diabetes, heart disease, even conditions like fatty liver disease, several types of cancer. They all have these strong links back to chronic inflammation.
And it doesn't stop there. Stroke, chronic lung diseases like COPD, obesity itself, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney problems, autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. The list goes on. Inflammation is often right there at the root.
Yeah.
It's actually a leading cause of death globally, these chronic inflammatory diseases.
Yeah, the statistics are pretty stark. Stat Pearls mentioned that in the U.S., a huge chunk of adults have at least one chronic condition. And worldwide, these inflammatory diseases account for a massive number of deaths every single year.
Which really begs the question, how does this process get started? How does inflammation go from being, a short-term fix to this long-term chronic problem?
Well, one way is if the body just can't fully shut down that initial acute response. Maybe there's a stubborn infection, something your immune system keeps fighting, but just can't quite knock out.
Right. Or think about constant exposure to low-level irritants. Maybe stuff you breathe in over a long time, like air pollution or certain chemicals.
And then there are autoimmune conditions. That's where the immune system gets confused, essentially, and starts attacking the body's own healthy tissues. That creates ongoing inflammation, like we see in rheumatoid arthritis or lupus.
Sometimes the actual cells that are meant to control the inflammation, they might have defects, so the whole system gets out of balance and stays fired up.
And even just having repeated episodes of acute inflammation can sort of prime the pump for a chronic state later on.
Yeah, and the UCLA Stress Lab folks brought up this idea of sterile inflammation too, SCI they called it, systemic chronic inflammation.
Right, triggered by damage-associated molecular patterns.
Exactly. These aren't infections, but signals from our own damaged cells that yell, "Help!" and trigger inflammation anyway.
So the damage itself sets off the alarm.
Precisely. And other things contribute too, like oxidative stress from free radicals, those unstable molecules, or things called AGs.
Advanced glycation end products. That's when sugar sticks to proteins or fats.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And even high levels of uric acid. These can all add fuel to the fire, mess with our mitochondria, the cell's powerhouses, and just keep that chronic inflammation going.
Okay, so that explains how it happens.
Yeah.
But who is more likely to develop it? Are there specific risk factors we should know about?
Yes, definitely several key factors. Age is a big one. As we get older, our cells can accumulate damage, free radicals build up, and we tend to gain more visceral fat.
That's the fat around the organs, right? Not the stuff just under the skin.
Exactly. And that visceral fat is metabolically active. It actually pumps out inflammatory molecules.
So obesity is another major risk factor then. It's kind of wild to think of fat tissue as an active organ releasing these things.
It absolutely is. And diet, of course, is huge. Diets high in saturated fat, trans fats, lots of refined sugar, they directly promote inflammation.
And I guess smoking is on the list too. No surprise there.
Unfortunately, yes. Smoking actually lowers the body's own anti-inflammatory molecules and directly causes inflammation. It's a double whammy.
What else?
Lower levels of sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen seem to play a role. They normally have a bit of a dampening effect on inflammation.
Interesting.
And then there's stress and sleep, chronic stress, poor sleep, irregular sleep patterns. They're all strongly linked to the release of inflammatory messengers called cytokines.
It seems like everything is interconnected.
It really is. UCLA also mentioned this concept of the exposome. Basically, everything we're exposed to throughout life, physical stuff, chemicals, biological things, starting even before we're born, it all adds up and influences our long-term inflammation risk.
Wow, that's a big concept. And speaking of influences, we can't forget the gut, right? The microbiome.
Absolutely critical. The trillions of bacteria and other microbes in our gut have a massive impact on inflammation systemically throughout the whole body.
So if the gut bacteria get out of balance, that's dysbiosis, right?
Correct. Dysbiosis, or an increase in gut permeability, sometimes called leaky gut, can let substances pass into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there, triggering this low-grade constant inflammation.
What kind of things mess up that gut balance?
Well, overuse of antibiotics is a big one. Also, frequent use of NSAIDs, those common pain relievers, or acid-blocking medications like proton pump inhibitors. Even just not getting enough exposure to diverse microbes early in life, and definitely our diet choices.
Okay, let's talk diet then. It really sounds like food can be either fuel for the fire or part of the fire brigade. What are the main culprits we should try to limit?
Yeah, the main things to watch out for are sugary drinks, sodas, sweetened juices, lots of refined carbs like white bread, white pasta, pastries, desserts, processed meats like hot dogs and deli meats,
Snack foods too, chips and crackers.
definitely, processed snacks, and certain oils that are really high in omega-6 fatty acids like soybean oil or corn oil, especially if they're out of balance with omega-3s.
Okay, so what should we be eating more of? What are the anti-inflammatory heroes?
Think color, think whole foods, lots of vegetables, broccoli, kale, spinach, bell peppers, deeply colored fruits like blueberries, cherries, raspberries.
Good fats.
Yes, high-fat fruits like avocados and olives are great. Olive oil, especially extra virgin avocado oil. Fatty fish packed with omega-3 salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies.
Nuts.
Spices.
Faith.
Nuts like almonds and walnuts, absolutely. Spices are fantastic. Turmeric, ginger, cinnamon. Even dark chocolate in moderation has benefits. Green tea is excellent. And, believe it or not, red wine in moderation thanks to resveratrol.
So it really boils down to a balanced diet, doesn't it? Getting enough protein, good carbs, healthy fats, plus all those vitamins, minerals, fiber, and just drinking enough water.
Exactly. It's about the overall pattern. And certain dietary approaches really shine here. The Mediterranean diet is a classic example. Low-carb diets can be very effective, especially if obesity is a factor. Vegetarian and vegan diets often show benefits too.
Makes sense. Now, beyond food, what other lifestyle changes can really help get a handle on chronic inflammation?
Exercise is huge. Regular physical activity consistently lowers inflammatory markers. UCLA even mentioned myokines.
Oh, yeah. What are those?
They're substances released by your muscles when you exercise, and they actually have anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body. Pretty cool.
Neat. And sleep. You mentioned sleep before. That seems crucial.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Poor sleep reliably increases inflammation. Aiming for that sweet spot of 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep makes a real difference.
Stress management, too, I imagine.
Definitely. Finding healthy ways to cope with stress meditation, yoga, spending time in nature, whatever works for you, helps lower those inflammatory cytokines.
And quitting smoking, if that applies.
Number one, if someone smokes. And losing excess weight. Even losing just 5–10% of body weight, as Stat Pearls pointed out, can dramatically reduce inflammation levels.
Okay, now I want to shift gears slightly. There was this really intriguing idea reported on Science Daily, something called unelimation. It sounds like a different way of looking at chronic inflammation. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is fascinating stuff. It's a hypothesis from researcher Maddie Patey. The core idea is that maybe chronic inflammation isn't just about having too many pro-inflammatory signals,
Uh,
but also about having not enough of the body's natural anti-inflammatory compounds, the ones that are supposed to resolve inflammation and bring things back to balance.
so it's not just that the on switch is stuck, but maybe the off switch is broken or missing.
That's a great way to put it. So the implication is that maybe treatments shouldn't only focus on blocking the on signals, but also on finding ways to boost the off signals to restore that natural resolution process.
Wow, that could really change things, couldn't it? The article hinted that this might explain why common anti-inflammatory drugs, like NSAIDs, work well for acute pain, but maybe aren't as effective long-term for chronic conditions.
Exactly. If the problem isn't just excess inflammation, but a failure to resolve it, then simply blocking inflammation might not fix the underlying issue of missing resolution molecules.
And it had some interesting angles on cancer, too. Something about potentially using inflammation.
Yes, though it's very early days. The idea is that some cancers might actually thrive in an environment where the normal inflammatory resolution process is suppressed. So perhaps carefully inducing certain types of inflammation or boosting the resolution pathways within a tumor could potentially help the immune system fight the cancer more effectively.
Okay, that's definitely food for thought. But important to stress, that's research, not current practice.
Absolutely. It's a hypothesis, a new way of thinking that needs a lot more investigation.
All this complexity,
Yeah.
it really highlights how tricky it must be to talk about this stuff effectively, right? Wolters Kluwer and Eastside Ideal Health Redmond touched on communicating these
They
ideas.
certainly did. Just the word inflammation itself can be confusing for people, let alone all the underlying mechanisms we've discussed. Using clear, simple, patient-friendly language is just vital.
It's not just simplifying words, though, is it? They mentioned other tools.
Right. Providing good, reliable supplementary materials makes a huge difference. Think uh, vetted websites, clear handouts, diagrams,
Visual aids.
especially visual aids. Eastside Ideal Health specifically mentioned video. Seeing an animation of how inflammation works or how diet affects it can often click for people in a way that just words can't. It builds understanding and trust, too.
Hmm. Now, one last really thought-provoking area from the UCLA research was about the developmental origins, how early life can set the stage.
Yes, that's incredibly important. They showed how things like childhood obesity or the types of microbes a baby is exposed to very early on, even psychological stress in childhood, these can actually program a person's inflammatory responses for life.
And they talked about the maternal exposome, too, how the mother's experiences affect the baby.
Exactly. The mother's diet, her stress levels, her exposures during pregnancy can influence the baby's predisposition to inflammation later on. This happens partly through epigenetics.
Those are like switches on our genes.
Kind of, yeah. Environmental factors can flip these switches, changing how genes work without changing the DNA itself. So the mother's lifestyle can essentially tweak the settings for the baby's future inflammatory health. It's quite profound.
It really shows that this isn't just about today's choices. The roots can go way back.
Precisely. It underscores how deep and complex chronic inflammation really is.
Okay, so pulling this all together, it's crystal clear that chronic inflammation isn't simple. It's systemic, body-wide, shows up in surprising ways, and has massive health implications. And it's shaped by, well, almost everything: lifestyle, environment, even things that happened before we were born.
It really is. But the encouraging part is that lifestyle changes do seem to be incredibly powerful. Focusing on that anti-inflammatory way of living, whole foods, movement, sleep, stress management seems to be the cornerstone of managing it.
Absolutely. And it leaves me with a final thought, maybe for everyone listening. Thinking about this unallimation idea,
Yeah.
the possibility that we need to boost anti-inflammation, not just block pro-inflammation. How might that shift how we approach chronic disease in the future? And maybe more personally, what can each of us do to better understand and support our own body's natural balance?
Those are really the key questions, aren't they? We definitely hope this deep dive has given you some useful insights. We encourage you to look into this more if it resonates, and always, always talk to your healthcare provider for advice that's right for you.
We'll definitely keep exploring health topics like this in future deep dives, driven by what you want to hear about. For now, thanks so much for joining us.